Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stared across the vast expanse of the Pacific from the bridge of the battleship Yamato, his weathered hands gripping the steel railing as the morning sun cast long shadows across the deck. The date was June 3, 1942, and the Japanese combined fleet was steaming toward what would become the most decisive naval engagement in Pacific history. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor, and the admiral who had orchestrated that devastating surprise attack now faced a terrible irony. He was leading his nation's most precious naval assets into what he secretly feared might be a trap. The massive fleet surrounding Yamato represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval power. For aircraft carriers Akagi Kaga, Soryu, and Here, you formed the heart of Admiral Keiichi Nagumo's first air fleet, the same force that had brought devastation to Pearl Harbor. These floating airfields carried over 250 of Japan's finest pilots, men who had honed their skills in the skies over China and perfected their deadly craft in the opening months of the Pacific War. Supporting them were 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, an armada that had seemed invincible just months before. Yet Yamamoto could not shake the growing unease that had haunted him since the Doolittle raid on April 18th. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's 16 B-25 bombers had struck Tokyo itself, shattering the myth of Japan's invulnerability and forcing the Imperial Navy into a desperate gambit. The raid had been more than a military operation, it was a psychological blow that demanded response. The attack on Midway Atoll was supposed to be that response, a masterstroke that would eliminate the remaining American carrier force and bring the United States to the negotiating table. The plan seemed flawless on paper. Midway, that tiny coral, atoll 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, was the perfect bait. Its strategic position made it invaluable to American defenses, and its capture would threaten Hawaii itself. Surely the Americans would commit their remaining carriers to defend it, walking directly into Yamamoto's carefully laid trap. The Japanese admiral had divided his forces into multiple groups. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American attention north, while the main force would crush Midway's defenses and annihilate any American fleet that dared to respond. But as the fleet pressed eastward through the gray Pacific swells, disturbing intelligence reports filtered through the radio rooms. American submarine activity had increased dramatically in recent weeks. There were troubling signs that the enemy might possess better intelligence than anticipated. Yamamoto's staff dismissed these concerns after all. The Americans had shown themselves to be reactive and predictable since Pearl Harbor, always responding to Japanese initiatives rather than seizing their own. What the Japanese commander could not know was that 1,200 miles away, American codebreakers at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor had been working around the clock to crack the Japanese naval code designated J-UN-25. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team had achieved what many thought impossible. They had penetrated the enemy's most closely guarded secrets. The Americans knew not just that an attack was coming, but when, where, and in what strength, as Yamamoto's flagship cut through the Pacific darkness. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of 2 nations and reshape the entire Pacific War. In the cramped, windowless basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over his desk, surrounded by stacks of intercepted Japanese radio transmissions and the mechanical chatter of primitive computer equipment. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his haggard face as he worked to decode what would prove to be the most crucial intelligence breakthrough of the Pacific War. For months, his team at Station Hypo had been painstakingly reconstructing the Japanese naval code J-UN-25, piece by cryptographic piece. The breakthrough had come in late May, when Rochefort's team detected increased Japanese radio traffic referring to an objective designated only as a F. The location remained mysterious until Rochefort devised an ingenious trap. He ordered Midway's commanders to transmit an uncoded message reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. Within hours, Japanese intelligence reported that AF was short of fresh water. The puzzle pieces fell into place. F was Midway Atoll, according to historical accounts documented in Gordon Prenge's Miracle at Midway. The intelligence breakthrough provided Admiral Chester Nimitz with unprecedented insight into Japanese intentions. The intercepted communications revealed not just the target, but the composition of the attacking force, the timing of the assault, and even the planned approach routes. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Americans would fight with foreknowledge. Of their enemies' movements, Admiral Nimitz faced a terrible decision. His available forces were vastly outnumbered by the approaching Japanese fleet. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, along with the hastily repaired Yorktown commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, represented virtually the entire remaining American carrier strength in the Pacific. These three flat tops, escorted by 8 cruisers and 15 destroyers, would face a Japanese force nearly twice their size. The American admiral's strategy was born of desperation and cunning in equal measure. Rather than await the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, he would position his carriers northeast of Midway, beyond the range of enemy reconnaissance, but close enough to strike the Japanese fleet when it was most vulnerable. The gamble was enormous. If the intelligence was wrong, or if the Japanese detected the American trap, Nimitz risked losing the Pacific Fleet's last operational carriers in a single engagement. Meanwhile, on Midway itself, Marines under Colonel D. Harold Shannon worked frantically to strengthen the Atolls' defenses. The tiny island, barely 6 square miles of coral and sand, bristled with anti-aircraft guns, coastal artillery, every available aircraft that could be squeezed onto its single airstrip. Flying fortresses, Marine dive bombers, and even obsolete Buffalo fighters were positioned to meet the coming storm. The psychological pressure on American commanders was immense. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy had suffered defeat after defeat across the Pacific. The Philippines had fallen, the Dutch East Indies were gone, and Japanese forces seemed unstoppable. Admiral King in Washington and his subordinates in the Pacific knew that another major naval defeat might force America into a defensive posture that could prolong the war for years. As June 4th dawned clear and bright across the Central Pacific, both fleets moved toward their fateful rendezvous. The Americans, outnumbered but forewarned, prepared to spring their trap. The Japanese, confident in their proven superiority, steamed toward what they believed would be another crushing victory. Neither side fully comprehended that the next 24 hours would determine not just the outcome of a single battle, but the trajectory of the entire Pacific War. At 0 for 30 hours on June 4th, 1942, Admiral Nagumo's carriers began launching their first strike against Midway Atoll. The pre-dawn darkness was pierced by the roar of engines as 108 aircraft Kate torpedo bombers, Val dive bombers, and Zero fighters rose from the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led this aerial armada toward the tiny American outpost. Confident that his force would crush Midway's defenses within hours, the Japanese pilots were among the finest in the world, veterans of campaigns in China, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Their aircraft, particularly the legendary Zero fighter, had dominated every aerial engagement of the war thus far. As they winged eastward through the morning sky, they carried with them the expectation of yet another overwhelming victory for the Empire of the Rising Sun on Midway itself. Radar operators detected the incoming Japanese formation at 05:53 hours, still 93 miles out. Air raid sirens wailed across the atoll as Marines scrambled to battle stations. Colonel Ira Kimes ordered every available aircraft into the air-flying fortresses. Dauntless dive bombers, Vindicator attack planes, and the outclassed Buffalo fighters that would bear the brunt of the Japanese assault. The aerial battle that followed was a savage demonstration of Japanese superiority in single combat. The obsolete American fighters were systematically destroyed by the nimble Zeros, with only a handful managing to reach the Japanese bombers. Captain Marion Carl, flying one of the few modern Wildcat fighters available, would later describe the engagement as like trying to fight wolves with house cats. The Japanese formation pressed through the scattered American defenses and began their methodical destruction of Midway's facilities. But even as bombs rained down on the airfield and fuel storage tanks erupted in towering columns of flame, the American defenders achieved something unprecedented. They survived. Despite the ferocity of the Japanese attack, Midway remained operational. The airstrip, though damaged, could still handle aircraft. The radar stations continued to function. Most critically, the island's anti-aircraft defenses remained largely intact. Testimony to the desperate preparations of the preceding weeks. Lieutenant Tominaga, circling above the smoking ruins of the American base, made a decision that would change the course of history. His aircraft had inflicted serious damage, but Midway was not neutralized. A second attack would be necessary. At 0700 hours, he radioed back to Admiral Nagumo. There is need for a second attack wave. This message reached Nagumo at the worst possible moment. Half his remaining aircraft were already armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for attacks on American warships. The other half were being prepared for a second strike on Midway. Tominaga's request meant choosing between maintaining readiness for naval combat or ensuring Midway's destruction, unknown to the Japanese admiral. American scout planes had already spotted his fleet. At 0552 hours, Ensign Jack Reed, flying a lumbering PBY Catalina flying boat, had broken radio silence with the electrifying message, "Enemy carriers bearing 3 to 0 degrees, distance 180 miles." The trap was sprung. Admiral Fletcher's carriers, positioned precisely where intelligence had predicted they should be, began launching their own strikes. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise at Midway itself, but they had walked directly into Nimitz's strategic ambush. As Nagumo's staff debated their next move, American torpedo bombers and dive bombers were already climbing toward their altitude, converging on the Japanese fleet from multiple directions. The battle for Midway would not be decided by the bombing of an isolated atoll, but by the greatest carrier versus carrier engagement in naval history. Admiral Nagumo faced the most crucial decision of his naval career as he stood on the bridge of Akagi at 0715 hours. The intelligence reports flooding in painted a nightmarish picture. American ships had been spotted to the northeast. They appeared to include at least one carrier. The carefully orchestrated Japanese battle plan was crumbling before his eyes, victim of American knowledge that should have been impossible to obtain. The Japanese admiral's dilemma was tactical and temporal in equal measure. His first strike against Midway was scheduled to return within the hour, low on fuel and ammunition. His flight decks were cluttered with aircraft being rearmed for a second attack on the atoll. Now, suddenly, he needed to prepare for naval combat against an enemy fleet that should not have existed in these waters. The process of changing ordnance from land attack bombs to armor-piercing weapons and torpedoes would take precious time that Admiral Spruance's approaching aircraft would not allow him. At 0745 hours, Nagumo made his fateful decision. He ordered the rearming of his reserve aircraft with anti-ship weapons, gambling that he could complete the process before any American attack materialized. It was a reasonable choice given the information available to him, but it condemned his fleet to face the American assault with flight decks covered in fuel lines, ordnance, and vulnerable aircraft. Meanwhile, the first American attacks were already developing. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet directly toward the Japanese fleet. 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers flying low over the waves in tight formation. These obsolete aircraft, slow and poorly armed, represented the cutting edge of American naval aviation just 18 months earlier. Now they flew toward certain destruction against the most experienced naval air force in the world. The slaughter that followed was complete and merciless. Japanese Zero fighters, led by veterans like Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Ataya, fell upon the American torpedo bombers with devastating efficiency. One by one, the Devastators were shot from the sky or exploded in towering pillars of flame and spray. Of Torpedo Squadron 8's 15 aircraft, only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the Pacific and watching the battle unfold from his life raft. Similar scenes played out as torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown pressed home their attacks. The American torpedo bombers, designed for a previous era of naval warfare, were systematically annihilated by the Japanese defenses. Of 41 American torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese fleet that morning, only 6 returned to their carriers. The sacrifice seemed futile. It's a testament to American courage but Japanese superiority. But Waldron's doomed squadron had achieved something more valuable than they could have known. By pressing their attack with suicidal determination, they had drawn the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches unguarded. At 09:55 hours, as the last American torpedo bomber was being shot down, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise appeared directly overhead. The Japanese carriers presented perfect targets, their flight. Decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Fuel lines snaked across the wooden planking, and ammunition was stacked in neat piles beside bomb carts. Zero fighters, having expended their ammunition and fuel in the low-level combat, were landing and being serviced. The timing was catastrophically perfect from the American perspective. McCluskey split his force, leading one section toward Akagi, while Lieutenant Richard Best took his bombers against Kaga. At the same moment, dive bombers from Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie dove on Soryu. Within minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers would be transformed from the pride of the Imperial Navy to blazing funeral pyres. At precisely 10:22 hours on June 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Dick Best pushed over into his dive, the nose of his dauntless bomber pointing directly at the flight deck of the Japanese carrier Kaga. Below him, the massive ship continued its routine operations, her crew unaware that death was plummeting toward them at over 400 miles per hour. In the space of the next 5 minutes, the entire balance of power in the Pacific war would shift irrevocably. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck Kaga's flight deck near the island's superstructure, penetrating to the hangar deck, where it detonated among fueled and armed aircraft. The explosion triggered a chain reaction of secondary blasts as aviation gasoline and ordnance cooked off in the confined space. Within seconds, the great carrier was transformed into a raging inferno, her flight deck peeling back like the lid of a sardine can simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's section was diving on Akagi, the flagship of Admiral Nagumo's carrier force. The first bomb missed, exploding harmlessly in the water alongside the carrier. But the second struck amidships, its blast opening a massive hole in the flight deck. Like her sister ship, Akagi's hangar deck became a death trap as stored ordnance, and aviation fuel created an unstoppable conflagration. The third Japanese carrier, Soryu, met a similar fate under the bombs of Yorktown's dive bombers. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadron achieved multiple direct hits, and within minutes, the carrier was dead in the water, her superstructure wreathed in smoke and flame. The disciplined efficiency of Japanese damage control, so effective in previous battles, proved useless against the scale of destruction visited upon the 3 carriers. Admiral Nagumo, standing on Akagi's bridge as his flagship burned around him, found himself witness to the destruction of Japanese naval aviation's irreplaceable core. These were not merely ships being destroyed, they were floating cities containing Japan's most experienced pilots, mechanics, and naval personnel. The men who had perfected carrier operations over years of training and combat were being consumed by the very aviation fuel and ordnance they had handled with such deadly expertise. The scenes aboard the stricken carriers defied description. On Kaga, Commander Takahisa Amagai struggled to maintain order as explosions racked his ship. Fuel fires spread across the hangar deck while secondary detonations hurled debris and burning aircraft in all directions. The carrier's damage control teams, trained to handle single hits or flooding, found themselves overwhelmed by cascading disasters that seemed to multiply faster than they could be contained. Aboard Soryu, Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto made the agonizing decision to abandon ship as fires spread beyond control. His crew, many of them veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Dutch East Indies campaign, reluctantly prepared to leave their ship. Some would survive to fight another day, but many would go down with their vessel, taking with them years of irreplaceable experience in carrier operations. The human cost was staggering, but the strategic implications were even more profound. Japan had entered the war with 10 aircraft carriers and a carefully trained cadre of naval aviators that represented decades of development. In 5 minutes at Midway, 3 of those carriers and hundreds of experienced aircrew were eliminated. From the Japanese order of battle, the mathematical precision of American dive bombing had achieved what months of attrition warfare might not have accomplished. Yet even as 3 Japanese carriers burned, the battle was far from over. Haryu, the 4th carrier in Nagumo's force, had escaped the American dive bombing through a combination of luck and positioning. Her flight deck remained operational. Her aircraft were ready for combat, and her crew burned with the desire for revenge. Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi, commanding Haryu, immediately began preparing his own strike against the American carriers. The Americans had achieved a stunning tactical victory, but they remained heavily outnumbered by the rest of Yamamoto's fleet. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers of the combined fleet still steamed toward Midway, their guns ready to finish what the aircraft had started. The outcome of the battle would depend on whether the Americans could press their advantage or whether Japanese resilience would yet snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of Haryu, smoke columns from 3 burning carriers stained the western horizon. Graduate of the Naval War College and veteran of countless battles, he understood better than most the catastrophic nature of what had just befallen the Japanese fleet. Yet he also recognized that one operational carrier remained, and with it, the possibility of salvaging something from this disaster. At 1100 hours, he gave the order that would launch Japan's desperate counterattack. Haryu's flight deck erupted in controlled fury as 18 Val dive bombers and 60 fighters roared into the morning sky. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led this strike force toward the American carriers, determined to exact revenge for his fallen comrades. The pilots were among Japan's finest men, who had learned their deadly trade in the skies over China and perfected it at Pearl Harbor. If anyone could turn the tide of this disastrous battle, it would be these veterans of a dozen campaigns. The American carriers, meanwhile, struggled with their own challenges. Yorktown, hastily repaired after damage sustained in the Coral Sea, battled just a month earlier, had already launched her strike aircraft and was recovering survivors from the morning's attacks. Enterprise and Hornet were similarly engaged in the complex dance of carrier operations, landing returning aircraft, refueling and rearming them, and preparing for subsequent strikes. None of the American ships was fully prepared for a determined Japanese counterattack. At 12:10 hours, radar operators aboard Yorktown detected the incoming Japanese formation. Admiral Fletcher, commanding the carrier task force from Yorktown's bridge, ordered his ships to general quarters and began launching every available fighter. The carrier's flight deck became a scene of organized chaos as F-4F Wildcat fighters roared skyward to meet the Japanese threat. The air battle that developed over the American fleet was a savage demonstration of skill and courage on both sides. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, leading Yorktown's fighter squadron, employed innovative tactics that would later bear his name, the Thatch Weave, to counter the superior maneuverability of the Japanese Zeros. American pilots, outclassed, individually fought as teams to break up the Japanese formations and protect their carriers. Despite the fierce resistance, several Japanese bombers broke through the American defenses. At 12:20 hours, Lieutenant Kobayashi's dive bomber screamed down through a curtain of anti-aircraft fire to plant a direct hit on Yorktown's flight deck. The explosion tore a massive hole in the wooden planking and started fires in the hangar deck below. 2 more bombs followed in quick succession, each adding to the growing conflagration that threatened to consume the American carrier. Yorktown's damage control teams, trained in the hard school of Pacific combat, performed miracles of engineering in courage. Chief Warrant Officer John Lindsay led firefighting efforts that contained the blazes before they could reach the ship's aviation fuel storage. Engineering crews worked frantically to maintain power and steering as smoke filled the lower decks. Within 2 hours, the carrier was making 20 knots and appeared to have survived the Japanese assault. But Yamaguchi was not finished. As soon as his first strike returned to Hiryu, he began preparing a second attack. 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros launched at 13:30 hours, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had earlier led the strike against Midway itself. This second wave would prove even more dangerous than the first. Approaching low over the water, where radar detection was difficult and defensive fighters were less effective, the torpedo attack developed with deadly precision, despite desperate maneuvering by Captain Elliot Buckmaster. Yorktown could not avoid all the Japanese torpedoes. To struck her port side, the explosions flooding her engine rooms and bringing the great ship to a dead stop. Power failed throughout the vessel, and she began listing heavily to port. The carrier that had survived Coral Sea and the morning's bombing seemed doomed at last. Yet even as Yorktown fought for her life, American dive bombers from Enterprise were winging toward Hiryu. The last Japanese carrier had revealed her position. By launching her strikes, and Admiral Spruance was determined to complete the destruction of Nagumo's force. At 1700 hours, 24 dauntless dive bombers appeared over the Japanese fleet, their pilots eager to avenge their comrades' sacrifice and finish the work begun that morning. The sun hung low over the Pacific as Lieutenant Earl Gallagher pushed his Dauntless into a steep dive toward Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier. Below him, the ship's crew worked desperately to clear her flight deck for another strike, unaware that American retribution was plummeting toward them at terminal velocity. At 17:25 hours on June 4th, 1942, Gallagher's bomb struck Hiryu's flight deck with devastating accuracy, the explosion marking the beginning of the end for Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. 3 more bombs followed in rapid succession, each one adding to the catastrophic damage inflicted on Japan's final operational carrier. Hiryu's hangar deck became an inferno as aviation fuel and ordnance cooked off in secondary explosions that shook the massive vessel to her keel. Admiral Yamaguchi, who had so courageously led the counterattacks against the American fleet, found himself trapped aboard a dying ship, watching helplessly as the last vestige of Nagumo's once mighty force succumbed to the flames. As historical accounts detailed in Walter Lord's incredible victory document, the destruction of all 4 Japanese carriers represented more than a tactical defeat. It was a strategic catastrophe that fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific. In a single day, Japan had lost not only for irreplaceable aircraft carriers, but also the experienced pilots, maintenance crews, naval personnel who represented the core of her carrier aviation capability. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato, hundreds of miles away, received the devastating reports with growing disbelief. The carefully crafted plan to eliminate American naval power had collapsed completely. Instead of destroying the remnants of the Pacific Fleet, his own forces had been decimated by an enemy that should have been caught off guard. The intelligence failure was complete and catastrophic. Somehow, the Americans had been waiting. The human cost was staggering beyond calculation. Captain Jisaku Okada of Kaga went down with his ship, along with hundreds of his crew. Akagi's captain Taijiro Ooki survived the sinking of his flagship, but the psychological wounds would never heal. Admiral Nagumo, the architect of Pearl Harbor's success, found himself presiding over the worst naval defeat in Japanese history. The men who had seemed invincible just 6 months earlier were now struggling to survive in the oil-stained waters of the Central Pacific as darkness fell over. The scattered fleets, the broader implications of Midway, became clear to both sides. For the Americans, the victory represented vindication of their intelligence services, confirmation of their industrial capacity, and proof that Japanese forces could be defeated decisively. Admiral Nimitz's gamble had paid off beyond his wildest expectations. Not only had he saved Midway and Hawaii, but he had eliminated Japan's ability to conduct major carrier operations for the foreseeable future. For Japan, Midway represented the end, strategic initiative in the Pacific War. The carefully hoarded resources of the Imperial Navy ships that took years to build, pilots who required months of training, and the operational experience gained through decades of preparation had been squandered in a single day's fighting. The dream of a quick victory that would force America to negotiate was dead, replaced by the grim reality of a prolonged conflict against an increasingly powerful enemy. The battle's aftermath would reshape the entire Pacific theater. Japan, forced onto the defensive, would spend the remainder of the war reacting to American initiatives rather than pursuing her own strategic objectives. The industrial might of the United States, freed from the immediate threat to Hawaii and the West Coast, could now focus on the massive buildup necessary for offensive operations across the vast Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto had achieved his greatest fear rather than his fondest hope. The attack on Pearl Harbor had indeed awakened a sleeping giant, and Midway had proven that America was not only awake but ready to fight with devastating effectiveness. As the burning hulks of 4 Japanese carriers slipped beneath the Pacific waves, they carried with them Japan's best hope of victory in the Pacific War. The strategic initiative had passed irrevocably to the United States. From Midway forward, Japan would fight a defensive war against increasingly overwhelming odds. Her early advantages erased by the flames that consumed her carriers in the waters off that tiny coral atoll. The empire that had seemed unstoppable, in December 1941, now faced the long, inevitable slide toward defeat.